Does this work? We can hear. Yes. Wonderful.
Good. Yes.
Great. Thank you all very much for coming. I believe we're to be in conversation. So conversation will be with myself and with Peter, and questions would be welcome at any point in the course of the discussion.
Absolutely.
Peter, first and foremost, how did you come to be so fascinated by, firstly, Macau, secondly, wartime Macau, most obviously, the personality of John Reeves?
It's an interesting question. I think for a lot of us of a certain generation, my father was in the Pacific throughout the whole war, and you grew up with stories of the fall of Hong Kong and the fall of Singapore and the Japanese occupation of most of Southeast Asia. And then when we lived in Hong Kong, we loved to come to Macau, just this incongruous little provincial Portuguese city stuck on the southern coast of China. And someone mentioned it was unoccupied. And then a very prominent historian, Jason Wordie, mentioned that the Royal Asiatic Society had published an edition of a manuscript by John Reeves, the British consul at the time, and I picked it up, and it was very dry, and it was kind of a literary effort by a civil servant, but I thought there's a story here. And when I retired, I decided to do the research and see if I could write something about it, because a popular version of it had not been written.
And what was the process or the challenge of doing this research? Because the primary source materials for this are all over the world.
That was a challenge, and luckily, with a consulting job, I was able to travel. The archives, the relevant archives, are in Hong Kong, Macau, London. A lot of the books, thank goodness, are in the New York Public Library, one of the great research institutions. Washington, D.C., Miami, Florida, of all places. Macau was the terminus for the Pan American flights before the war that would start out in San Francisco and 8 days later would reach Macau. And the Pan Am archives are in Miami, and of course, the Braga archives are all in the National Library of Australia.
Right, yeah. How long did it take you, shall we say, flash to bang, from getting the idea until last draft?
I started researching January 16, and the book was printed last weekend. It took about three and a half years of research. The hardest part was actually the outline, and then a couple of years of writing.
Right. So many particular themes are covered within this, and as a novelization, it's fascinating because it just brings in real people, real events, genuine experiences. But the themes that come within it, refugees, the intelligence gathering role that Macau had at that time, the balancing act between the Portuguese, the national government in China, the Japanese, Britain in Hong Kong, and then Britain in Macau, shall we say. All of these particular themes, which was the most challenging for you to explore?
The most challenging, maybe what genuinely surprised me when I started the research was the role that Macau played in the Second World War. And in one sense, the real hero of the book is not so much Reeves as the governor of Macau at the time, Governor Teixeira, because he made the astounding decision, and astounding because if you go and look at those maps that are upstairs and see what a tiny town Macau was, with no food, no farm, no natural way of supporting itself, he made the decision that they would open the gates to refugees. And in essence, anyone who arrived in Macau could stay. And to think in 1935, the population was 150,000. In 1940 census, population had swollen to 300,000. Almost all of that increase being Chinese refugees that had fled the fighting in China. By the end of the war, it was 600,000 people. And just look at those maps and think of cramming. And I actually checked, I actually Googled it, so I think this is right. The current population of Macau is not much bigger. It's about 600,000. And obviously, it's a much bigger city. But that decision to essentially open it, and then if you had any connection to Portugal whatsoever, Portuguese had a far more liberal definition of what constituted a Portuguese than the British had of what constituted a British citizen. You were not only admitted, but you were given an allowance, and and they found housing for you. Not very nice, but you had a place to sleep.
This is the thing, and that of course is Macau's real time of triumph and honour. I would suggest is the fact that at that point in time they opened the gates to everyone. Right. And I mean, I'm reminded of this. I'll cut in a little of my own story, because a book I wrote on Macau many years ago now, a very dear friend wrote the foreword for me for this, and that was Irene Smirnoff, who is the elder daughter of George Smirnoff, the painter who was here in 44, 45. And one of Ira's remarks, she died, by the way, back in November, late last year, but Ira made the remark in my foreword that in the time that they lived in Macau, there was always food on the table, they went to school, they had as ordinary a life as possible, and no one at any point ever made them feel lesser because they were refugees. And I think that's a thing well and truly worth bearing in mind in today's world, when refugees are so commonplace and so commonly derided and not given the attention and care they should deserve. I mean, people who get up and go are the ones that should be encouraged because they've got up and gone. They're going to be ornaments to any society they come to. But that was Irene's remark, that at no point were they ever made to feel that they were not quite as people as they should be. And I remember another lovely story that Irene mentioned was that she used to go out accompanying her father when he was doing his sketches for the paintings. And there were 3 children, and the baby was at home with the mother. Nina, the second daughter, used to spend most of her time with Leo and Tilly Delmado, who were living on the little house next to the tennis court at Santa Sancha. And they would go off and do their sketching and come back. And always when they went, there was always a rather larger tea than just to be there for them. There'd be something extra to eat. So it was a way of suggesting that, okay, these people don't have a great deal, and you don't give charity, but you have a nice meal and an extra cup of tea. I think that's really a good way to be. But she did say that that was so much the case in Macau at that time, and it was widespread. And anyone who was here at that point, and there are still people in Hong Kong today who have that memory, they all say the same thing. That you might be sleeping on the floor of the Bella Vista and you know exactly which corner of the floor that you're sleeping on, but you were there.
It was, I mean, if you were poor and Chinese and had fled your little farm in Canton province to avoid and came to Macau, life was grim. I mean, the government did their best, and the Chinese aid societies did their best, but there was starvation and there was poverty. But if you were Portuguese or middle class, when you think that the war was raging around you just across the border, life was astoundingly normal. You read about prize givings, you read about amateur theatricals, you read about dinners in shaded gardens. The ice plant kept working, and so there was ice cream, there was ice in your drinks. The schools kept going. It was this kind of Casablanca cum Shangri-La that had avoided the problems of the world. In the National, there were 5 English language newspapers published in Macau, and a few copies of them survive in the National Library of Australia from late 44 and early 45. And I looked at them, and I took pictures of some of the advertisements. And, you know, there's the little grocery store offering Australian butter. There are European and American pharmaceuticals available at the drugstore. There is Scotch whiskey, there's Jamaican rum, There, you know, if you were middle class, or as Stanley Ho said, for the wealthy, anything was available. But life went on in an astoundingly normal way.
And the astonishing normality with this, if you're talking about people with money, again, oral history is so interesting when talking to people who are now dead, and I've had that experience many years ago. Remember Pat Mitchell, or latterly Pat Nigel, now passed away in Hong Kong. She was here with a mother and a brother. And we spoke about Macau and poverty and refugees, and she was a teenager, English teenage girl, born and brought up in Hong Kong. And she looked at me with incomprehension and says, well, but we didn't see that. You know, we go to the dressmaker and the money was remitted from London. It was kind of there. So if you had that level of income, it passed you by what was going on. And in the same way as you mentioned with shops containing everything, Roger Lobo made a remark to me once, and that was that you could get absolutely anything just by putting it in order. Because the smuggling networks going up the West River and into the interior, things would be coming in by air, because the nationalists, of course, are hopelessly corrupt. So everything was coming in from Calcutta over the hump into Chongqing and then to Kunming. So if you wanted something, whatever it might have been, you'd put in the order, and a week or so later it'd find its way down, whether it be a bottle of Chanel No. 5 or some new Kodak film or whatever it might have been. Just extraordinary. But it would take about a fortnight, he said. Just send the runner up and the message would come back.
The local grocery store was advertising Australian butter. And another one, my favorite ad, I wish I had the slide to show you, was a sale on American toilet paper in early 1945 that had been stolen from some American airbase.
Yeah, that's it. And that kind of thing was
smuggled into Macau.
That's where it's so fascinating, because that was the stuff that was coming into West China. So they had the air bases in Kunming. So that would be coming in via India. And the Australian butter, by the way, was tinned. It wasn't refrigerated. So, I mean, at least you get the reality of that. But you could get all of these things. It was coming in through West China, so you could get tin butter and as American loo roll. Oh, weird. Intelligence gathering. There's a lot of that.
There was a lot. I think in the course of just research, I've found at least 9 different spy networks in or around Macau. The most interesting one was the British Army 8 group, which was a professor of physiology, Lindsay Wright, at the University of Hong Kong Medical School, had been in the Hong Kong Volunteers, captured during the fall of Hong Kong, escaped, and then set up this espionage, cum humanitarian, cum help the escapees.
MI9, escape and evasion. So that was the intention with this, was getting information in and out of Hong Kong, but also aiding those to get out and others coming in.
And then he had a network of about 9 to 12 spies actually within Macau. The Japanese had a big spy network in Macau. There wasn't much to discover in Macau if you were a spy there, but they were trying to, and so they were kind of looking at each other. The Japanese were primarily interested in finding out where the Allies would land in China in preparation for the invasion of the Japanese homeland.
And again, the oral history component comes in with this, because you mentioned Reeves's typescript, which became the faded flag. I recall in 2005 being out in Cape Town visiting his adopted nephew, David Calthorpe, who was behind the publication of that. And David made the remark that John had told him that at one point in Macau there's this hockey match charity thing, and both he and the Japanese consul had to attend. So they're sitting side by side. And of course they're diplomats. So what's going on in the outside world is a different thing. They're a different kind of person. And one means, oh devil, how are you managing? Well, how are you? Because through their own networks, they made it very sure that one went out and the other one stayed in. So they didn't accidentally bump into each other on the street. But there they were in this social function where one's sitting next to the other. And you can go back and check the files that this was through the networks within hours. They're talking. What are they talking about? It was really, well, how are you? Well, how are you? How are you coping? So it just goes to see where these curiosities take place.
The Foreign Office issued orders to all of its diplomats and consuls in neutral country. If you ran into an Axis diplomat, you would treat them with, quote, cold indifference. Reeves and Mr. Fukui It's a better pronunciation than I did.
Very bad.
Actually were friends. The Japanese consulate was at the beginning next to the British consulate. The Japanese consul was instrumental in getting Reeves's wife out of Hong Kong. She had been in Hong Kong Christmas shopping, captured and interned in Stanley. And sometime at the end of January, the end of February, as a diplomat's wife, she was freed and allowed to come to Macau. So they had a cordial relationship, the two of them.
And again, you can get an idea there of just how unexpected the idea was of hostility, that the consul's wife would pop over for a few days to do the Christmas shopping and then boom, it all blows up. So you literally don't know what's going on next. Yeah. So with those networks, and what else was going on?
Well, I mean, Reeves is the reason I got interested in Reeves is I think of him as a lonely, tragic man. He had joined the China Consular Service in 1933, and the China Consular Service was, you joined it when you'd been rejected everywhere else. You'd been rejected from the diplomatic service. You'd been rejected from the regular consular service. You'd been rejected from the Levant consular service. You'd been rejected from the Indian civil service. What was left was the China Consular Service. And because these men, they were all men, were sent to incredibly lonely little cities. If you look at the map, the 28 cities that had British consuls, some of them were at the very end of the world. And there's a 1927 report of the Foreign Office I found, which talks about having done a survey of the China consulate. They found insanity, they found drunkenness, they found theft, and horror of horrors, they found the taking of Chinese women as mistresses and concubines openly and notoriously. So that was, and then Reeves was sent to Macau in June 1941. His career was failing. His previous postings had essentially not been very important. The document that said he was sent to Macau for a rest cure. Macau was of no importance. The British were a little worried about the Japanese investments. They had opened bank branches. They had made a bid for the electric company. The Japanese had sent a consul in April. They sent Reeves in June. But he was just meant to sit there. Okay. He was just meant to sit there. And then suddenly, December the 7th, on one side of the date line, and December the 8th on the other side of the date line, the Japanese declare war on the West. Within 4 or 5 months, they'd occupied most of Southeast Asia, and this kind of lonely, tragic man with a drinking problem found himself the only Allied representative within thousands of miles of occupied Asia. And
the thing is, he was an eccentric figure. Molly Kay, MMK, who wrote The Far Pavilions and various other books based on her India life, she had lived in China in the early 30s because her mother had been born there and her father had taken her and her sister there in the hope of finding husbands for them. Didn't quite work that way. But they were part of that expatriated circle in Peking at that point. And in one of her memoirs, she mentions John Reeves as being one of the party group there, along with Anne Bridge, who wrote her books and others. But what comes through in this memoir is this eccentric figure. And you write about the eccentricity. David Calthorpe, I mentioned, he widely remembered Reeves for long hair and a ponytail and this cape that he had tailored in Peking and wore forever when they were living in South Africa. How did you find that as an author to explore the eccentricity?
I think that was kind of interesting because he had clearly been shunted aside by the Foreign Office. And then he had to do this astounding job from 42 through 45. He took care of 9,000 British refugees, or 9,000 refugees with a claim to British citizenship. He had a staff by the end of the war of close to 150. There were a lot of embassies that were smaller than that. He accounted for every penny he had spent down to the last 7 or 8 pennies.
Yeah.
And he took care of them, he housed them, he ensured they were fed. He did an incredible job. Yet he was unsuited for being in the civil service. He was constantly provoking his bosses. One of the little things, he insisted on spelling Hong Kong as one word. In 1841, when Hong Kong was handed over to the British, it was one word. Foreign Office had decided in 1926, we'll write it as 2. Reeves ignored it.
The Hong Kong Bank, by the way, still ignores it, but never mind, look at the banknotes.
He had unauthorized contacts with the American OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. He ran his own spy network. He was always ordered to stop this stuff. At one stage, in 44 and 45, he put together a committee for post-war Hong Kong. And if you look at the document, which is in the National Library of Australia, it's this 80-page document. It goes on from everything from the design of the identity cards to where the sewers, where the drains were going to be laid. And if you look at the title page, the org chart, the organization chart, right at the top, at the very top, center at the top is John Reeves, Your Majesty's Consul. And this document got to Westminster, and of course they had their own plans for post-war Hong Kong, and they went completely nuts. At one stage they were looking to see if they can get a plane into Macau to get him out and replace him with another consul. Obviously in wartime that was impossible.
But do you not think that there's an element with people like this, where one finds this in other periods in times like this, where cometh the hour, cometh the man. They're almost the right person for the job. Hopeless at any other, useless in peacetime, but at that point in time, they came into their own, and then no good again afterwards. Was that a fair remark?
The minute the war was over, the Foreign Office, because consuls couldn't be fired. A lot had early retirement from neurasthenia, a polite word for going completely out of your head. They tried to force him out. They sent him to Rome, which sounds glamorous, but the territory there assigned him with the poorest provinces in Rome, and then all of the outlying islands. And then in 49, they sent him to Surabaya, the capital of Dutch Java. And Surabaya was in November 1945, was the scene of bitter fighting in which the British military had put down a rebellion of the Indonesians against the Dutch colonial government with great loss of life. And even today in Indonesia, November the 10th is celebrated as Heroes' Day. Impossible assignment for a junior British diplomat. Sorry, he wasn't a diplomat, he was a consul. Far inferior thing. And within a few months of getting to Java, he resigned and moved to South Africa.
Yeah, and then had a career as a broadcaster, reading the news on SABC for decades, with apparently his mellifluous British voice, which was exactly what the Afrikaners liked at that point in time.
But
lend some tone.
But you were absolutely right. His friends describe him. At the end of The Lone Flag, if you read the afterword of that, you'll read a description from his friends. He can turn completely eccentric. He'd dress in Chinese robes. He grew his little fingernail in one of those curved, that the mandarins at the turn of the last century grew in. He wore his hair down to his shoulders. And if you could think in Dutch Afrikaners in the height of apartheid, this, with the Calvinist church, he dressed in his robes. He had an ivory cigarette holder. He had his own pair of ivory chopsticks. He had, wine was served in goblets, surrounded by Chinese curios and things like that. His wife and daughter left him the minute the war was over. He never saw them again. They went back to England. When he died, his daughter had died some. When he died, his friends contacted he's still his wife. He was never formally divorced, and she renounced any interest in his estate.
Now, that you've chosen to novelize this, why?
I originally thought that I would write an actual history. And then when I realized I would have to spend time in Japanese archives and Portuguese archives working with researchers, and I'd be 120 before I even finished the research, I decided to tell the story through Reeves's eyes. And novelization just enabled me to make it I tried to stick as closely as possible to the historical facts as I knew them. There were gaps that had to be filled, but it enabled me to tell a story in a vivid way that was still true to essentially what happened.
What would you feel that you may have left out?
I mean, there's a huge amount. My first draft was 2/3 the length of War and Peace. And my editor said, you know, Peter, with a gun to their head, your children are not going to read this. And so we cut 2/3 of it out. His time in Peking with Molly Kay, for example, some of the amazing, I talked to this with my Alicia, some of the amazing women that I found. Emily Hahn is in there. Phyllis Harrop, I don't know if, and of course, the first the first woman to be ordained as an Anglican priest was ordained, and
Florence Lee,
and presided over the Anglican services for the British community in Macau at the little Protestant chapel 20 yards from here. Phyllis Harrop was an astounding woman.
Yes.
Divorced from her she had married a German in Shanghai. He literally beat her, divorced him, moved to Hong Kong, learned Cantonese, was an assistant commissioner with the Hong Kong police, essentially in charge of fallen women, i.e. the vice trade in Hong Kong. Then, when the Japanese invaded, rather than escaping, she stayed behind and worked with the Japanese medical officers to set up brothels in Hong Kong. And in her book, she said, she thought it would be better that the Japanese soldiers had access to professional prostitutes rather than raping among the women, among the general female population. And she said, let the moral philosophers make of this what they will. She then took her German divorce papers, turned it into a German identity card, escaped to Macau, and then went to Fort Bayard.
Yep.
And was taken by sedan chair for 6 days until there was a rail link to Kunming to Chungking to Kunming, and then over the hump to Calcutta, and then to London.
And I mean, this is the thing which, with wartime Macau and wartime Hong Kong too, which people often don't realise is just how porous these frontiers were, that you didn't have to go terribly far and you're into this grey zone where money passes hands and you're travelling at night and suddenly you're into free China and the life is more or less normal.
Yeah. I mean, if you read a little, if you're an amateur reader of military history, you tend to think of the Japanese lines or the German lines. Well, the Japanese lines didn't exist in China. The Japanese had 1 million troops in China, but if you think of 1 million troops spread out over the vastness of China, that's not very many. And they largely stuck to the cities and other strategic points. Once you were in rural China, there were bandits, there were guerrillas, there were warlords.
And that's what you had to worry about.
That's what you had to worry about, but not Japan. And then Reeves helped 300 people escape from Macau to Chongqing. And if you think about that, you are going to walk from Macau to somewhere in the middle of Sichuan province through Wuchang, China. And the 8 or 9 accounts I found of these escapes were just fascinating. No one was in real danger, yet the sheer how grueling the trip was. The sampans with just a plank at the back for a toilet, sleeping in these barns with the lice and the rats and the fleas and everything. You know, the bandit, everybody just wanted a little bribe, but you were fed. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 13 weeks, 3-4 months later, suddenly you crossed an imaginary line. You were in nationalist China. There was a man from the British Embassy who had been sent to look for you. You're put on this train. You're flown to Calcutta, and then suddenly you're in this government rest house with white sheets and a Sikh waiter who's bringing you coffee, and it was clear.
And as you and I were talking about both in Hong Kong and earlier today, when you read these accounts you mentioned with Mrs. Fletcher and their escape out, and remember reading and then talking to her as well with Tilly Delmado, because Leo and Tilly went out from Macau in mid-1945 for Leo to join the Hong Kong planning unit in London, and they went out by sampan at night and then travelled over at night, sleeping in the daytime, so going in sedan chairs sort of up into the interior. But what comes through with this in these accounts, and Tilly's, she wrote it many years later, it's called No Priority, because she was always stamped no priority when they wanted an airlift somewhere. What comes through is no physical danger. It's discussion of fleas and rats and can't wash your hair and the clothes are all telltale grey and you feel grubby and awful, but no physical danger. And that's what you mentioned as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the bandits, the BAAG, the British Army Aid Group, and Reeves's network of bandits and pirates, he had bribed them all. And they looked at it as they were just providing a service.
And
I mean, you shouldn't underestimate. I mean, you are going to walk from here to Sichuan. I mean, you shouldn't underestimate how hard this was. But you didn't have to, death was not a problem. Everything else was a problem.
And of course, what comes in with this time period, which is the sort of thing which the current government likes to hear, and that is that people were in greater danger from nationalist forces around about of selling you to the Japanese than the communists. The communists were vehemently anti-Japanese, so as soon as they realised that you'd escaped from them or you'd resisted them, wonderful, fantastic, couldn't do enough for you. Yeah.
And that's just one little footnote, is the British Army Aid Group, who were getting prisoners out of Hong Kong and getting in, they depended on the East River guerrillas operating in the new territories to move them in and out, and they were all communists. And the British military attaché in Chongqing kept ordering them not to cooperate with the communists because that upset the nationalists, but it was the only way to get people in and out of Hong Kong.
Yeah, and the rat line running from Wai Chau into occupied Hong Kong via High Island operated right through the war. And, yeah.
Exactly. You had a question, sir?
I had an observation, listening to your conversation. The question about the refugees into Macau.
Just a second, Stephen.
All right, the question about the refugees into Macau, how many of these would have been forced by the Chinese themselves? It would be the communists, the nationalists, the bandits, and percentage probably forced by the Japanese. Because as you rightly mentioned, the Japanese was very thin in the neighbourhood. They're certainly not going to be in all the waterways of the Delta. The refugees coming in, how much were forced by the Chinese bandits?
Jason and I were just talking about this before. The Japanese they wanted to empty Hong Kong as much as possible. They didn't want to feed people, so they were eager to get people who had a Portuguese connection out of Hong Kong into Macau.
But the reference would be the Chinese, which come in through.
And the Chinese were simply fleeing the fighting.
But also, if you look at Chinese refugees coming into Macau and also into Hong Kong in the pre-war era, there were quite a number who had come from further up the coast, Shanghai in particular, in 37, 38, because businesses operated often a branch industry. We have some family friends who were with the tobacco company in Shanghai, and they came down to Macau at that time to set up a branch of the tobacco works. So you had the accountant and some skilled workers and others who would come. So were they refugees from the Shanghai area? Well, kind of yes and no, but they were in Macau throughout the war. And then when we look at the emptying out of Hong Kong, this is a thing worth bearing in mind, because Hong Kong was always a net importer of food and fuel. And the go-downs, when the Japanese took over, were full. The place was absolutely chock-a-block with everything you could imagine. And what is so interesting with this is that right through the war, or when I say right through the war, until late 1943, early 44, if you had money, you could get almost anything you wanted. And I touch on this because a book I'm working on at the moment, have done for the last couple of years, is a biography of a friend who died some years ago, whose family had gone from Macau to Hong Kong in 1841 and set up the government. It's quite interesting. But they had an account book during the war, Gloria and her mother did. And it's fascinating. It's an economic history of the war in terms of we wanted this, went to that shop, sold the carpet, got this, bought something else. It was extraordinary what you could get if you had the money because the shops were full. But that's a sidebar to it. The fact is that the go-downs were full. The Japanese were exporting things from Hong Kong. So stripped out the go-downs, got what they could out. But they were in no urgency to intern anyone they didn't have to, because if you put them in camp, you've got to feed them. Leave them outside, they can die on the road. Doesn't matter to them. So there were people who came over into Macau who had the most tenuous connection to Portuguese nationality. They got a cedula, which indicated that their grandfather had come from here. So they were signing these on, getting people in, and the Japanese were very happy for it. Just kind of go. That's someone else's responsibility. Yeah.
I mean, there was especially the Portuguese who'd been generations in Hong Kong. I mean, some of the diaries and some of the accounts were incredibly bitter about their treatment by the British. They could only ascend to a certain level within the big institutions like HSBC. There was one Portuguese who said, "One drop of Portuguese blood and I am Portuguese. In Hong Kong, one drop of Chinese blood and I am Chinese."
There was an element of that. And the thing with this, and you in your own research bring this through, Dr. Gazano is an example of this, because with the British Army Aid Group here, now I interviewed him for a project I was working on 20 odd years ago. He was very old in California, and he was extremely bitter.
His book, if you read it,
there's little memoir that he wrote in old age. It's one of the most bitter screeds you could imagine. Very, very hard done by, and very, yes, bitter is the term, but bitter as well against their own people, because this family were partly Goan and they were very dark, and that was rather held against them by the Portuguese themselves. The Mestizo Branco were a different category altogether, so one must understand that. We can look at that binary, and as you say, one drop of this or one drop of that, but that community often looked down upon each other. It's often not usually referred to.
We've got 45 minutes?
We're at 45 minutes, or we've...
Oh, okay. We started late. Are there other questions?
Please.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if Charles Boxer appears in your book.
He doesn't appear in his book, although there's a vague reference. There's a chapter with his mistress, Emily Hahn, who is trying to get the divorce papers smuggled out so they can be formally married. But Charles Boxer, he ran British military intelligence. He was married to a woman that was known as the most beautiful woman in Hong Kong.
Ursula.
Ursula. She was evacuated to Australia when they moved all of the pure-blooded British women to Australia. He had a tumultuous affair with Emily Hahn, and she and they had a child together, whose daughter, whose name I'm now blanking. Carola. Yes, exactly. And she put the birth announcement impudently in the South China Morning Post to Major Boxer and Emily Hahn, a daughter, Carola, despite the fact they were not married. Again, there's just too much. But a fascinating, and they stayed married after the war, although they lived apart. She was in the United States a lot, and he was in England, and he did those great books of Portuguese history.
They were actually married in New Haven, Connecticut.
They were married in New Haven, Connecticut? That I did not know.
And to jump in with that, again, I'm sorry to keep bringing myself into the story, but I had a most magnificent day with the pair of them in England in 1996. Some months before she died, she'd come over from New York to be with him. And they were living in Hertfordshire, and I went up and had the day. And she, at 90, was exactly what you'd expect. He was a little bit away with the pixies now and again, but she was completely there and very, very entertaining. Yeah, wonderful.
She was a graduate of the Wisconsin School of Mines. Which is just astounding. The woman in the 20s, she'd written a kind of a sex manual, again in the 20s, which women were not meant to do that sort of a thing. Had married to a Chinese writer in Shanghai for a while, paraded her chimpanzee in a dinner jacket through the garden just north of the Gibbon. Sorry.
And I must mention one anecdote of her, because again, one of the things with oral history and talking to people decades ago as you hear things as a much younger person and then can relate them as an older person. And one story that was told to me by a lady in Hong Kong who had encountered her just in 1941. This woman was newly married and she was about 19 and was at a dinner function, and Mickey Hahn turns to her and says, "After you, they're going into the dining room, after you, my dear, after you, because you're a married woman and officially I'm a virgin." And she's only about 6 months pregnant, but there we are, yeah. And this lady said she never forgot it to the end of her days, and I imagine you wouldn't either.
So when
It would, you know, I'm waiting for the phone to ring. It would make, I mean, there's so many vivid things that happen. You could
I'm
make,
just listening to this conversation.
you could make it, you
Written
could
the
make,
script, have you sold the rights?
we got our fingers crossed. It would make a great movie.
It would be a fabulous movie. It really, really would.
Absolutely.
And the thing with it is it's adventurous, it's exciting, there's a positive vibe to it. It's doing good things. Yeah.
You mentioned Casablanca, I think, you know, we
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely.
The other Emily Hahn story I've got she walked into the Hong Kong club where women weren't admitted, and somebody said, "I understand, Emily, you're putting down a boxer rising." And she said, "Don't worry, I've got the matter well in hand." Which was a racy thing to say in whenever.
And of course, this brings in what in many ways a suburban society Hong Kong has always been, in the fact that half a century later, someone always had a Mickey Hahn story to tell, which just goes to show that it is the kind of society that really didn't get many originals. And that is, if you look at it the other way, as you think, well, and I noted this 30 years ago, all these old people all had a Mickey Hahn story to tell. And if they didn't have a Mickey Hahn story to tell, it was a Han Si-yin story. It was one or the other. And you think, these are originals. Why has no one else got something to say?
Her daughter wrote for The New Yorker for a while. She was alive in the 90s.
The daughter? Oh,
Yeah.
she's still alive.
She's still
both
alive,
of them are.
okay.
Yeah.
She was alive in the 90s, and she's still alive now?
The younger
Good.
one, Amanda's still an actress. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Peter, during the war, there were many artists among the refugees. I still did not read your book, just arrived here in Macau. But does your book reflect the intense cultural life that?
Not really. There was just so much that I had to leave out. I mean, the Macanese you read. I mean, you hate to use cliches about nationalities and things, but the Macanese love of music. The concerts continued throughout the war. The amateur theatricals continued the war. Education continued during the war. Smirnoff, that's the most famous one. But no, I found references to that, but there was just no space to put it in the book. But again, it was back to the point I was making. It was an astoundingly normal life, considering what was happening in the rest of the world. In fact, just a few miles over the border. And the arts was certainly played a part in that.
And within that element of normalcy, this is when you mention Smirnoff with those wonderful paintings. The backstory of them is so fascinating because I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with them. They're all one size. The reason that they're one size is that was the only size of sketchbook that he could get. And if you look at the wartime paintings, there are a number of colours that don't appear in them. And that was because they had a child's paint box that had been given by Father Cooney, one of the Jesuit priests, and there are a couple of tubes that had been largely squeezed out. So there are a few colours that he couldn't use because they weren't there and they couldn't get the pigment. So it's very curious with that in terms of what was available and what wasn't.
I mean, in Reeves' Lone Flag, I mean, this is kind of the perpetual worry of a bureaucrat. He was constantly scrounging for paper to make records for each of the refugees. Every refugee and every refugee family had an index card, and they wrote on it the allowance that came, the weekly allowance that they came, the medicines that they took, the visits to the doctor. and his accounts of just trying to find paper
That's
to
it.
keep track of the records with that were,
Yeah.
and they were just scraps in the end.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Any other questions? Which there might be. Yeah.
You said your father served in World War II. Yeah. What as?
Sorry?
Navy, Air Force?
No, he was actually in the New Zealand Army,
Oh, really?
and then until 1944, and then he was sent to the Western Desert.
Okay.
But he went through the Solomons and Guadalcanal and things like that.
Did he meet Kennedy?
What?
Did he
He
meet
didn't.
Kennedy?
He didn't meet Kennedy.
That's
And before he died, he came to Hong Kong and visited us, and Jason gave him a wonderful tour of the Japanese defenses, which astounding. Sorry, the defenses against the Japanese.
We had a wonderful day, and was the only person I'd ever spoken to who'd served in Fiji, because that was, of course, the staging post for Nandi for the airport, and that was fascinating to listen to. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that was a long time ago, 30 years ago, was it? Getting on?
It's getting on to that, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you indeed.
And thank you for... Whoa.
And congratulations to Peter for having written a most wonderful book.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you.